Emily's little boy. It's a little boy. And no, we're live. Okay, we are now live, and this is Senate Finance. And, okay, it's you. You're gonna do the consumption tax? No.
Oh,
No, what, I know Emily's son was sick, and you guys have done some reshuffling, so come on up and tell us what we're taking out.
Yes, it's changed since you had that.
Okay,
It's basically today's tomorrow's switch.
okay, so today we're doing the income-based education tax study, and tomorrow, hopefully, if her little boy is better, we can do the consumption taxes, but if he's not, we will, because when I last heard she was gonna Zoom in, but I guess he's still with the doctor, so she's not Zooming.
It is useful for you to have my legal overview and then her presentation of the fiscal impacts. I think it would be preferable to have us go at the same time, but if you want me to come in prior to her being available, that's fine.
Okay,
Whatever you like.
we will play it by ear and find out how sick toddlers are.
So I wasn't planning to project this time because the report is about 80 pages and we were going to summarize.
I mean, I don't get to see all those graphs and,
Yeah, very nice. So for the record, Abby Shepherd.
but these are online, right? So
Yes.
they are on the committee page on your iPads and computers.
Yes, Bill has kindly posted that under today's page, under the committees.
Okay.
So Julie and I will both be presenting today because we were the primary legal and fiscal staff people for the study committee. I'll start with explaining sort of the genesis of this committee, explain some other very similar work that was done over the summer leading up to the fall when the study committee met. Then I will walk through the recommendations and Julie will present a lot of the incredible amount of work that she did modeling what this would look like if a shift.
You're only seeing the final product. There were probably 5 products before one got to be final, so
Yes, and part of
everybody did an enormous amount of work on this.
what makes the report so long, the actual explanations and graphs are about 30 pages. There are many appendices. We did not include all of the presentations that were given, but there are links to everything in that report. Additionally, there is potential legislation. That's about another 40 plus pages of what that would look like if the bill were actually to pass. Before we get there, so that's just sort of a general overview of what's in this document. And Madam Chair, of course, was one of the co-chairs, so she's very familiar with everything that's in this report. So there were last session, there were 2 study committees that were passed in 2 separate bills looking at very similar information, requiring different studies on a similar proposal, which would be how would an income-based education tax be structured if it were enacted to replace the homestead property tax system, really shifting the source of education funding in Vermont. So there was one that was a little more restricted, and that was a study committee primarily made up of the Department of Taxes and the Agency of Education. There was some consulting work, JFO as well.
Is that the one that came out of here?
So that is the report from the administration. They actually did submit a separate report, which is also available. If you'd like, I can provide you with the link. It's on the legislative webpage. And that report did have some of the same deliverables. They met first, and then the study committee that this report came out of met in the fall. And the charges that were placed on this study committee were a little more in depth and more lengthy. There were more deliverables from Act 175 last year. So this study committee was charged with studying how the renter credit would be restructured, or whether a new credit would be created to address shifting from a property tax-based education funding system to an income-based education funding system. under the assumption that renters could potentially be paying two separate taxes, so both on their income and on their non-homestead property, that they pay the taxes through their rent, ostensibly. So looking at how to address sort of the renter problem and putting quotation marks around that, but how would renters be treated under a new education funding model? The other charge was how to transition. So those first years of transitioning from property tax to income-based tax, how that transition would be rolled out, what that would look like, all of the different issues that could arise in a transition. Accurate modeling, and that's where JFO's work was, and the tax department were spent a lot of the initial part of the study committee's work looking at modeling and how to even get at data to estimate what the impacts would be changing from property to an income-based system, given that there are different definitions of income, so you use different metrics to look at impacts. And for the property tax credit, it's household income. For income tax, there are multiple different definitions for income. Another charge for the committee was to determine whether there should be a limit to the amount of income subject to a new income tax or education income tax, whether that would be a policy decision that should or should not be made. The other challenges, there were some sort of catch-all, any other relevant considerations, but also challenges for administering a new education income tax, both in the transition, but also ongoing challenges, both due to changes in tax base or any other administrative concerns. There lastly was a charge to consider the impact on the general fund from the shift from a property tax base to an income base, and any impacts that might have on the state's taxing capacity, given that there would be two potential income taxes imposed on income. How would that impact the general fund, since all income taxes go to the general fund? So as I mentioned, Julie and I are staff persons. We are nonpartisan. None of the recommendations here represent our own personal views. This is purely a summary to let you know what the study committee considered and ultimately decided. So that is the enabling legislation.
Any question about enabling legislation? Okay.
Because I also realized I did not give Julie a chance to introduce herself. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Julia Victor, Joint Fiscal Office. Good to see you all again.
So I will sort of plow ahead through what the committee covered and what the recommendations were. And please stop me if I'm sort of steamrolling through, because I know I'm throwing a lot of words out. I know most of you are very familiar with the property tax system, but if I say something that sounds odd, or just please stop me and I'll try to clarify. So the conclusions that came out of the study, based on those charges that I just listed, just scrolling to get the final list. The study committee spent a fair amount of time at the beginning of the meetings discussing what scope of its charge it should really focus on, and decided that with only 6 meetings, the best use of its time was to focus on how and not the should. So not whether the state should move to an income base to fund education, but rather if it did, how that would be structured, what are the structural changes that would need to take place, and all of the sort of litany of policy decisions that stems from saying, yes, we will move to income-based. How do you do that? So that's really what this study committee report is laying out. So there are obviously policy decisions being made, but they're premised on, once we've said, yes, we're moving to income-based, how does it work? So the primary recommendation, if an education income-based tax were enacted, that education tax should be structured progressively. So the way that the personal income tax is structured, with marginal tax rates and income brackets, and that the income base, so the tax base, should be adjusted gross income, and it should be of all Vermont taxpayers. So similar to personal income, where both residents and non-residents are subject to income tax on their Vermont income. So it wouldn't only be for Vermont residents.
Excuse me, Mr.
Yes,
Clark.
absolutely.
We would tax out-of-state second homeowners pay an income tax, but based only on money earned in Vermont.
Correct. So I liked that you're already talking about homes versus income, Vermont
Yeah.
income. So we're really just looking at Vermont income because you could have someone who doesn't necessarily own property in the state, but spends time in the state. So they have, and they're earning money in Vermont, so they have Vermont income.
Also, it's not just second homeowners.
Exactly. It's detached from the property question that arises with current property tax.
I think that confused me more because we have a lot of people who own property here, but claim themselves as a taxpayer in another state.
Yes.
They
So
would still pay or they would not pay.
So it would get into the individual situation, but it would work the same way that personal income tax works, where an individual may be, is domiciled in another state, so they have a residency in, say, Massachusetts, but they're in Vermont, irrespective of their property ownership status. If they're in Vermont, earning Vermont income, and then there are certain thresholds that would trigger a requirement to file. and
Okay,
then
but I
the-
think the bigger concern is having a lot of second homeowners in Vermont who don't claim Vermont as their domicile.
So there's
That's,
another part of the
And that includes them.
that get a
Okay.
home owner, or second home
This
owner.
is only for homestead owners, people who.
okay.
Well,
If I may,
I thought it was not just for homestead owners. Isn't that what you just said?
Sorry, so this is the income tax portion. I haven't gotten, and I assume that's what Julie's gonna get to, is how
tax
the
the property.
property tax would be amended under this, but I'll let
But I
Julie.
mean, I live in New York and I own a couple of properties in
Mhm.
Vermont that I
Okay.
use as Airbnbs.
Okay, so that's
I
different.
pay an income tax on,
On your income earned in Vermont, and you would be subject to the non-homestead property tax.
oh,
The
okay.
committee did not recommend repealing the non-homestead. So that would apply to second homes. I'm sorry. I got it
Yeah,
right.
okay, sorry.
And we're working on the assumption that there's probably a bill out there getting more granular, I think the word was, into non-homestead properties. Basically second homes, deer camps, and commercial property.
Okay. Whoever is working on that magical bill, I'm happy to be helpful.
I'm just assuming it's
Okay.
out there, I have not seen it. But
And-
we can do it anyway.
right, it sounds like the committee has already and Abby has done a great job explaining, but just to reiterate, we remember that property is two different categories when we're looking at the education property tax in the state, right? We have our homestead property, we have our non-homestead property. And this study committee, as Abby mentioned, is only looking at doing away with the homestead property tax and replacing it with an education income tax. So we're not talking about the whole property tax structure, but just changing the homestead property tax.
Meaning
structure.
they didn't touch the non-homestead.
Yes and no. So to jump ahead to that recommendation, the non-homestead would be maintained on anything that's not a primary dwelling, but it's actually expanded under this proposal. So if a home has over 2 acres, those 2 acres around the home, if that's the primary dwelling, would not be subject to property tax, but the amount over those 2 acres would be subject to non-homestead property tax.
Which it
So
is
it's
now.
expanded. All of it would be subject either to homestead or non-homestead, depending on the classification.
I think another helpful way of thinking about that is we recall in the current education property tax system, there are certain places or certain buildings, properties that are exempt from paying property tax. And so that's like pious institutions, for instance. There's exemptions, nonprofits. There's exemptions for certain properties to not pay property tax. So this recommendation is saying, okay, we're going to exempt the primary dwelling, the homestead, and the surrounding 2 acres from property tax. And then all other acreage attached to that parcel will now be taxed on the non-homestead rate, which currently all of that acreage that's surrounding that primary domicile is taxed at the homestead rate.
which may or may not be higher or lower than the non-homestead. Because that, since we did this breakout, has varied depending on how the values have gone in individual towns. But there's more than a few right now where the homestead is actually higher than the non-homestead.
Right, and I do think that that's an interesting conversation that's coming up about that difference between non-homestead and homestead rates. And we recall that the homestead rate is a function of local spending decisions. So that is the determination of the homestead rate, or one of the factors that goes into determining the homestead rate, as well as there is the property tax credit. So that income sensitivity portion for homestead property taxpayers, it doesn't exist for the non-homestead. So while the tax rate may be higher for homestead property owners, that doesn't mean that their tax liability would be higher.
Because of income sensitivity.
Correct. Sorry, Abby.
I'm glad that this is more of a discussion than me just reading off your list. And just if you are following along in the report, I am actually looking through the list on page 26 of the report for the conclusions, which is similar to the executive summary. Just trying to have some structure to the discussion, but I don't think I did clarify that the proposal to eliminate the property tax is homestead only, not non-homestead. So thank you for raising that question. So in terms of the structure of the tax base would be AGI on all Vermont taxpayers and the progressive marginal tax rates. That was a great segue into how the tax rates would apply and how they would be set. So I might turn to Julia for the details of this, but this was also something that the committee spent a long time discussing, was how the tax rate should apply, whether local spending decisions would be maintained, and how they would be set. So they would apply by school district, and then there would be an increase or a decrease according to local spending decisions, comparing to the prior year's statewide average. So there would still be an adjustment for rates based on local spending, and the setting of the tax rates would also be the same. So you would still have towns, voters voting on the school budget. The General Assembly would get the December 1st letter from the Commissioner of Taxes recommending rates based on the amount of revenues in the education fund. There would no longer be yields, but the General Assembly would set the education tax rate, so the income rate, and the non-homestead property tax rate to balance the ed fund depending on the revenues.
It wouldn't be much simpler, because we haven't gotten to tax years yet.
Yes, I hadn't planned to get into that in detail.
Okay.
I can.
That was another complication.
There was a lot of discussion about how to get that, how to structure this, and yes, which tax year would apply and which tax rate. Because it would be shifting from property tax years, there'd be, instead of property tax years, you'd be looking for income tax years. However, school years are like property tax years and run on the fiscal year basis, July 1st to June 30th, same as the school year. But you're looking at income over really a calendar year, so a taxable year. You end up having two different school rates during the income tax year. So when an individual would actually pay their tax, so it would be through the same processes that personal income tax is paid, so either wage withholding or estimated installment payments. They would be based on the prior year's estimated liability, or the prior year's liability or their estimated liability. And then there will be reconciliation like you do when you file your personal income tax return. And the final rate would be the average, the effective tax rate. Because of the school year split, it would be the effective rate that would apply against income for the whole year. Otherwise, you could have two different tax rates. Individuals could, shift income to pay the lower rate. So the recommendation was to ensure that there's one tax rate and that's all reconciled at the same time as filing a personal income tax return. So I can pause there because that was a lot.
Yeah, it was. When I listen to that, I hear the concern that people raise in the back of my mind about the look back And if they got divorced or their income changed significantly, but their property tax stayed the same, does this, in what you just said, does that resolve any of that for people?
It no longer has the lag.
Okay,
Property tax
okay.
credit, yes, I think that's what you're
Yeah.
referring to.
Right.
But you're still reconciling the prior year's income and it being taxed at the current year rate.
Right. But
Yes.
let's say, like, I don't wanna, but sometimes I'm mad when Senator Cummings goes off on a tangent in my committee, so I don't wanna make this to be a tangent, but, you know, let's say two people are living in a house, they get divorced 6 months into the year. And then, like, does that true up at the end of the year that, okay, we went from these two incomes for 6 months to one income for 6 months, and this is the actual income that was under this roof for the
Oh,
last
so
year?
you're thinking in terms of household income, which is under the property tax credit, which would no longer be applicable. It would be following the personal income tax rules for filing, and filing status.
Okay, would it, okay,
So it would,
maybe I'm confusing myself, would it be the personal income of both of the people in that property, or that's never, not an issue anymore? Like,
it would be an income-based tax, so it would be based on the filer, and there are special rules that Vermont piggybacks onto. So we follow federal rules for divorce in particular, or legal separation. And there are, I think it's a day, a certain number of days, like 6 months out of the year, if I'm remembering correctly. So you would no longer be looking at household income, you'd be looking at filers. So it could be married filing jointly, could be married filing
it would still be
separately.
filers in a particular house though, right, or just in a school district?
It's still based on income, so it's in a school district, yes.
So that's what, it still should be tied somehow to where you live.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, does that make
So
sense?
that's
It's just not the
the questions
property.
you're asking
Yeah,
would have to be resolved if we were gonna go to the route of a income tax instead of
right,
a property tax.
and you're saying that they're not, like, they didn't resolve that, or-
They consciously decided to not answer the question if we should.
Right, so
Okay.
the committee, the
Okay.
committee, as Abby mentioned, only explored if this were to happen, how would it happen?
Okay,
And one of the recommendations
Yeah.
of solely the structure that the committee reached
Mhm.
was this locally adjusted income tax rate. So
Okay.
the income tax rates would be adjusted by district spending decisions. Similar, but not exactly the same as they are right now. Getting to your question about, you know, what happens with divorces, as an example, or changes in income. So in the committee's recommendation, where, or with whom a person lives,
Mhm.
with the exception of renters, no longer plays the same role as it does in the current system,
Okay.
because the homestead property no longer,
it's a concept, but.
is a concept. So you could have two single filers living in the same home,
Okay.
you could have a joint filer living in the same home. Their income, education tax rates would be adjusted in accordance with their district's spending decisions. Now, if those two people, in this hypothetical, if those two people were to divorce, under the current system, I think that, as Abby mentioned, you're talking about that lag in property tax credit. So the household income adjusts, but then it requires another year for that property tax credit to catch up to the adjustment.
Yes.
As
Only at
Abby,
that point would this question, your question has to be resolved if we were gonna go that way.
Okay,
right, and then in the committee's recommendations here, as Abby mentioned, it would be following the same principles as the income tax, what happens when individuals divorce. That would also apply for the education income tax.
Additionally, there was discussion about individuals moving between school districts, which rate would then apply. So there's the filing group, there's either the individuals filing, single headed household, surviving spouse, all of those personal income tax filing statuses would apply. But if someone is moving, then you need to determine which school district rate is applying for that full year. So one of the recommendations, the proposal was to have it be where the individual resides on either January 1st or the first day that they become a resident of the state.
So I want to back up a little or go to that 100,000 foot level, just ask a question. Can you remind us of what the charge to the committee was in terms of like a design? I mean, I know what we're considering, but was the driver equity? Why didn't we look at this?
Time to go to graphs.
That was a large part of what Julia worked on as well, was providing principle. You have all had that almost identical presentation at NCSL, I believe, has the pillars of a good tax system. The committee also considered those pillars and how they interact with each other. Of course, you're all well aware of the tension between some of them, such as simplicity versus equity and fairness. So I don't know if you or Madam Chair had a.
Well, no, there were lots of graphs, starting with the one that we have where as a percentage of income, higher income people pay a smaller percentage of their income for education. And that's been the goal, is to level that. In hard dollars, they pay a lot more in actual cash. And so the graphs, they got colored red, white, blue, and I think we settled on gray. We kept looking at the impact, and some schemes you ended up with people at the low income. There are 17,000 Vermonters who don't pay an income tax. And some that pay on the value of their home because it's worth less than their income, even though they're covered. So there's all kinds of complications. And our goal was to get kind of the smoothest graph we could without hurting the folks at the bottom, without raising the folks now up to that $90,000 cap, keeping them either down or level, and then getting more at the upper end. And that's where we spent most of our time, was in doing runs. Julia was here in the tax department, and Graham was in Kentucky on Zoom, at least through the first part of November, awaiting access to New Zealand. And they did a lot of runs for us. And I think the final set is as close as we could come to level. We never got into, is there too much at the other end? If your tax bill is going to go from 3,000 to 30,000, is that too much of a shake? So people at the higher end.
Okay, so at the same time, you're saying is the president's system too little?
Yes, that was where we started. Okay.
I think I'm at that same level as Senator Bray, and I'm trying to understand if we need to focus on the should piece. And as a member of the committee, I'm kind of curious, and since I'm still relatively new to the Senate, has it been decided that we should do this, or did this committee just not agree if we should do this? But maybe we need to decide if we should do this before we dive deeper into the details.
The committee had 6 meetings, and we didn't start until after the summer. So scheduling got to be a challenge. And we just I don't think anyone realized how much, it was like, what, you just do an income tax, right? You put everybody pays X percent and there you go. And then we got into trying to make it fair. And then things got complicated. The big one for me, and I've been very clear, is this: we don't know how much tax capacity there is at the upper end. We know, I think we have 10 people over $1 million, 100. We have no billionaires. but we don't know how much, if we take from the income, whatever that pool is up there, which we don't know, if we draw out this much money, what does that do to the general fund's ability to fund everything else? The league was in. I think it's fair to say that there is no city or town out there that would not like to have more tax capacity. And yes, if we do this, they will fill up some of that void, just as they did when we did Act 60, and some of us saw a steep reduction in our school taxes. The communities gradually used up that capacity, and so it's possible people in some towns could end up paying more this way than they do now. We don't know. But should we do it is still out there. We didn't even start that one.
Quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Who are the organizations that are saying we should do this? Because that is not in my inbox right now.
You know, the only group that came in to testify was Public Assets. And their testimony was, and watch me if I'm remembering it, because I've got my own filters, that if we are going to fund things, anything, the fairest way to do it is through income, because that most reflects your ability to pay.
We'll hear from them.
That's as close as, I don't think we had anybody else. Did we have the league in? Yeah, the league liked it because they could use the extra tax.
There's a list of witnesses, that's what we're showing.
We didn't have much in the way of outside testimony.
Yeah, so for folks who are looking at the report, it's on page 33 with the list of witnesses. There are a lot of testimony from Legislative Council, Victoria Fiscal Office, the Department of Taxes, and then the other stakeholders that the committee heard from were Deb Brighton, the chair of the Tax Structure Commission, Jeff Fannin from the Vermont National Education Association, Karen Horn from Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and Stephanie Yu from Public Assets Institute.
But it was not. It was heavily our staff and number crunching.
So bear with me here, because I think the wealthier people in the state are second homeowners. They are people who, so, I mean, I'm just gonna say, like, I'm just gonna put a theory out there that, you know, we probably have more people at that higher wealth level who have a second home in Vermont than we do people who consider Vermont their primary home. So the overarching question to me, if my hypothesis is correct, is are we pushing more people to want to become non-Vermont residents, or basically game it out so that they pay far less on the property tax as a non-homestead, because would be way less for them than what they would pay based on income, and we'd actually lose more tax capacity from the higher end of the spectrum. Whereas if you I mean, I don't know if it's completely illegal or impossible to do an income-based payment for second homes. If anyone considered an income-based payment for second homes and not just charging wealthy people at the income rate for their homestead?
When you said the legal, so my first initial reaction is whenever we talk about second or non-residents, there are the constitutional parameters that say you can't treat non-residents differently than you would treat residents,
Okay.
as a general rule.
Yeah.
But then the state does have wide latitude. So second home is only non-residents. So that's how we do currently treat non-homestead, which includes second homes.
But so actually you'd be treating them more fairly if you said they're also paid based on income, right? If you have a second home, we're asking you to also pay based on income.
Except how would we know their income?
It would still have to meet the constitutional requirements that you're not taxing income that Vermont doesn't have jurisdiction over. It would still have to be Vermont income.
Okay.
And this proposal was an income tax on, say, a non-resident's Vermont income and a non-homestead property tax on their property.
Okay.
Going back 25 years in my memory, it is unconstitutional to tax different classes of people differently. But it is constitutional to tax different classes of property differently.
Yes,
That's,
and I'm anticipating that if there isn't a bill introduced shortly, that we will be having that discussion. It started last year, but like in the middle of April, that you will, to divide out into at least two, but maybe more than two, because you remember, there are a lot of Vermonters who own camps, and they are still camps. Lake Carmi comes to mind. Significant portion of the city of Barry has, out in Joe's Pond. It's not just out of staters, but the complaint we've had is that the out-of-staters putting up the big houses and paying millions of dollars for them is inflating the value of the Vermonters that were generally middle class who built a camp. And it still is pretty much the same. So and then there's the argument that out-of-staters don't send kids to our schools and we're taxing them to pay for it. So we're gonna work through all of that. But I think we will at least see a differentiation in different classes of property in the non-homestead. And if that can be done without any tax change at this point, just say there's a rate, without yet changing a rate, just this is the sections. Okay, Senator McDonald.
Was there not also a reasonably long discussion on whether or not income was in versus property tax on these homes that are second, third, fourth, fifth homes? But which one was more stable as a resource
That is.
in changing economic times?
Yes, that is something that we used to have until about 5-6 years ago, a legally required general fund transfer to the ed fund, which is income-based, but it was required. And it also was required that it be inflated by a inflation standard every year. I know the appropriations people were very upset during the downturn in the early part of this century when they were required to give more money to the schools while they were hatcheting other state programs. It's always been recognized that schools need stable funding. You can't cut out math midway through the year. And even now, the town collects it, the town is required to pay the school. If there's a shortfall, the town swallows it. That was before Act 60, but the schools are guaranteed the funds that they vote. The question is, if we get a hard, not a soft landing, and the sales tax goes away. There was a lot of talk about levers, what you could move. I've learned to like that word. The levers you could move to make up that shortfall. But the place you would have to fall back on is the property tax. If the income tax or the sales tax, and they are both very dependent on national, economic conditions, if they came out, would we just say to the school, sorry, you've got to take a 10% cut like everybody else? Or would we protect their funding? And we didn't work that one out either.
My question was, given the two sources revenues based on the houses assessed value, based on the residents' income, which one is a more stable income source as you go from recession in and out of recessions?
It's,
Was there a conclusion?
well, I think historically it's been the property tax. That's why we relied on it, because it's stable until this past year. when-
Last year, there was a discussion about whether or not that was in fact true. Has there been any follow-up on that?
So there was, yeah, to get to your question, Senator McDonald, there was an analysis that we presented or that focused on the 6 principles, one of which is sustainability and reliability, that looked into the difference of property tax and income. And I know that this is a caveated response, but it depends on exactly how you measure or consider sustainable or reliable. I can certainly forward the presentation to the committee or walk through it now, but I don't want to get ahead of myself in terms of summarizing a lengthy conversation.
I gathered from the answer that the question of which one is more reliable as recessions come and go is they're closer than we had perhaps thought before this study, that they are closer together than we had thought. It isn't automatic. It depends on a variety of how you choose to tackle it.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, one of the questions when looking at sustainability and reliability is how diverse your revenue base is. So by cutting out property tax and moving a larger percentage into income, you're a lot more reliant on that specific base. Also looking at how property taxes, how we're able to forecast property taxes currently as compared to income tax revenues coming into the state, we see that we are a lot better at forecasting property tax revenues than income tax revenues. Of course, that's a function of how they're calculated in the state. When looking at the fluctuations of the tax base, that's another way that we can get at it and look at the different factors. I don't want to talk to what will happen in the future, because that's really Tom Cavet's work. I don't want to present someone else's work. I don't know if that gets at your question.
I got my impression after we listened to some initial proposals a year ago was that people, that we had always thought for years and years that the property tax was a solid thing that wasn't volatile, and income was, and that last year's discussion, it said, slow down, they're a lot closer together than we had imagined.
That was also the argument that was made when we went from the property tax transfer, which is income tax based, to the sales tax. But we now have, if we do this, we have our two sources. We don't have a guarantee from the general fund. Our two sources are connected to the local economic, or the national economic, or worldwide economic system. And so the likelihood that both of those sources will go up and down in tandem is greater.
And I'm just pulling up the slides to remind myself. Yeah, so we did talk about how income taxes are less predictable than property taxes. I think I mentioned that. We also looked at how income tax collections and property tax collections have developed over time. And as I think the committee would imagine, we've seen for income tax volatility that there's been steady growth, but bumps along the way, like the .com recession, the Great Recession. And we've seen for property tax volatility, a slow upward climb. So with less drastic bumps. And then the third thing that we did talk about was the concept of balance and how state revenues
There were a
balanced.
couple other issues that came up. One of those tax structure principles is your competitiveness with other states. we actually collapsed those top two tax brackets at the behest of the last tax study committee, because their task was to make us more competitive. National things take that top margin and say that's their tax rate. We would now be adding what would probably be close to a 3%. That'll all get added in. And what will that do to our competitiveness? The other thing that came up is when the towns fill that void, even if they don't fill all of it, but they were quite clear they could stand some more road and all kinds of other taxes, that local property taxes are not at all progressive. They're, you have an income base when you get to the state property tax, but the local portion of that, you pay it no matter what your income is. So you're going to increase that kind of a regressive tax structure. And we tried to play with the $47,000 super circuit breaker, but we can't break that one, which we haven't figured out yet. Senator Chip.
So I definitely would expect income to be a lot more fluctuating, a lot more volatile, because income is very transient. Income, people can be motivated to exit the state for a variety of reasons. So if our goal truly is to switching or considering switching to income-based funding for equity, my concern is shared with Senator Hinsdale that it's the unintended consequences of the perverse incentives that it might create. So for me in this discussion, I'd really love to hear directly from PAI, from a renowned economist like Art Wolf, to just weigh in on these types of things, and also my former colleague Senator Chris Pearson. I would really love to hear the arguments for the should piece.
He was.
I respect the distinction you make between that you're not addressing should we or shouldn't we. You're saying if we did, how would we do it?
Yes.
But I think those separate questions can overlap. Namely, if we were going to do it, we would have to do it this way. And we can't do it this way, therefore we can't do it. I mean, that's the, and I've got to say that has been the logic in previous explorations of this question. I would say for myself, I can go back 34 years of thinking we should be on income rather than property. And being with people, other people agreeing we should be on income rather than property. And there are always problems. This is not intended to be a challenge, it's an actual question. Has something changed since we've been told the various reasons why we can't? They're basically, about the people still talk about the three-legged stool. Okay, yeah, and that anytime you back off, anytime you shorten one of those legs, you can only shorten a leg so much, and that there are problems with going to income. Also, that the people with a lot of income have a way of hiding it. And if nothing else, they just lead with it.
Would this fix that
They
though?
go away with
Would this fix their ability to hide their income?
And I think,
and certainly wouldn't be, you can't hold the prisoner. It's not to leave.
and it is my understanding, I believe Senator Pearson was one of the sources during the discussion, that there will be a bill. There is a bill being introduced in the other body. And so we will have a chance to do the should. This is the first time there's been talk and there's been bills. And the other thing is this income has been looked at to fund the Green New Deal, free college, healthcare. It's just out there. If we take it, then there will be opportunity costs we lose. It won't be there to do other things. So, but this was the first actual real investigation into what would it look like? How would you do it? It went from sounding, well, you just add a surcharge on, which is how it got presented to us from the tax committee. Yeah, well, you know, if you just did 3% on everybody, this is what the bills would look like. Then you start trying to do the details, and it got to be somewhat more complicated. There seemed to be an assumption that all businesses use payroll. We're texting you.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, we're running a few minutes late.
Excellent, we're out here.
Okay. It got to be a little more complicated. So, but this was the first real,
One like structure, such as saying is more complicated.
than just saying everybody, we put a 3% surcharge on everybody. Or everybody pays X% of their income.
That always happens.
Yes.
If I may, just to get to your questions, I don't know, I do want to reiterate, and I know that Abby mentioned this, but just for the record, that we were the staff people working on this committee, so everything that we're presenting here is not a reflection of us nor our office, but really just helping to help you work through what the study committee explored.
You're doing a good job of neutrality, trying to read between the lines what your opinions are.
No, they did a really good job testing out every one of our iterations.
I'm sorry I don't have my report in front of me. I did bring my computer to this committee room, but it's sort of hoping this is a question specifically for you. Did you then model out what the rates would need to be to match our current? Do we have that? Can we go to that part? Like
Yeah,
how much does it raise if you do X versus what is the X% that you would need to do to?
so that's a great question. So the committee did ask us to model a number of different iterations. And I don't know if we've gone through all of the recommendations that the committee did make. So I guess the quick answer to your question is yes, but we did preliminary modeling runs that were really meant to serve as a starting point of what a bracket structure may look like, but the committee didn't decide on the number of brackets or how the rates within those brackets should be adjusted. And the rates, of course, are determined by a whole range of other policy decisions, like how are renters handled. So the more that renters are exempt or credited within this system, of course, the more money that's going to need to be raised to pay for that tax exemption. That all of those caveats being said, we do have.
Can I ask, well, on the render piece, I might have missed this, but was there a conversation about choosing whether or not to exempt residential rental from the non-homestead versus giving renters a credit? Are both of those answered? Is that?
That's absolutely what the committee discussed. Those two
Okay.
different options were considered. The ultimate recommendation was to go the route of a credit, which, as Julia just mentioned, would directly impact the rates in the end and how those would be set, because then where would that money come from, assuming it's coming from the education fund? Because the renters would, and that was a lot of the discussion too, is how would renters pay, and then how would they reconcile and get that credit? It would end up being a tax credit.
Because, I mean, I'm asking, no, the community now, because if you gave a credit, that would go to the owner of the building and they might still charge market rate rents in the area, so
So
it's
the
just
credit
like.
would go to the renters, because the renters would be
That's,
paying.
but that's why they didn't choose the other option, to exempt
I'm trying to remember.
residential rent.
In terms of the policy discussion, why it wouldn't be an exemption. I think the concern is more about changing circumstances throughout the year that, I think there was also the concern about, I hate this expression, but skin in the game, where some renters maybe would have higher incomes and would, although, you know, would they be paying two different tax types, both funding the education fund, but is it, you know, again, a policy decision, is it appropriate for higher income renters to be paying more? So the credit would be a little more the exemption could be drafted in such a way that it also took into account income, but the discussion behind the credit was it would be a percentage of rent paid. So it would get more at, the ability to actually pay.
And there is a
taxes.
standard, I gather, as to what is, maybe it's an accounting standard, but what percentage of rent would normally go towards property tax. Was it 14%? Somewhere around there?
So the recommendation wasn't a set rate. The committee did consider the previous renter rebate under Act 60. It was up until just a couple of years ago, it was 21% of rent paid, and then it was again reduced based on the renter's income. So there was a range provided of 10 to 21% that would be given as a credit. But you've gotten to the gist of how do you address sort of the renter problem where they're paying two different taxes? And those are the two either options, either an exemption or a credit.
And I can say that we just felt really thrilled with
It wasn't a resounding.
it. It was like, we couldn't find anything better to do.
It sounds like a fun task force here.
It was heavy duty task force and lot of numbers crunching, and a lot of numbers got crunched. But I think that's pretty much where we are. Are you the press? Okay, we are up against our capacity.
I was just about to do it.
But we're about to switch out.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so
I'll just.
if
be
you're
on
here
top.
for the healthcare, yeah, they're in the hall.
I appreciate it.
Okay, all right.
There are a few other sort of smaller. I don't know if you want us to sort of breeze through those or if you wanted to hear from.
I
Julie
told them
or-
we're running a few minutes late, but so breeze through them. And they apparently don't check their phones because I asked them to text.
The remaining issues, so there's the rent credit, so it would be a credit, not an exemption. Both were considered. Again, the policy discussion was, trying to determine whether some renters perhaps would have the ability to pay more, and then also tying it to the amount of rent paid and not tying it necessarily to what tax is actually being paid on the property in particular, because rent doesn't necessarily reflect property taxes paid. There's discussion around that. It would be a non-refundable credit as well. In terms of the property tax structure and administration, because that was crucial to the discussion as well, is what would happen to the existing property tax structure for education funding. So the homestead property tax and the credit would be repealed, but the non-homestead, so second homes, commercial, anything that's not a homestead would still be subject to property tax, and it would also include the exempt portion that's a homestead at 2 acres, but non-homestead would apply to everything over 2 acres. And municipalities would still be involved in valuation, billing and collection, all of that structure would.
They're not gonna take their money away.
And the cash flow to school districts and to and from towns would be maintained. The discussion around stability and volatility was discussed, and there wasn't a firm recommendation because of the complexities of adjusting the education fund to different revenue flows. There was a recommendation to increase the stabilization reserve, but no set amount was recommended. So that's in actually this list starting on page 26 of outstanding issues. So where really the committee didn't have enough time to dive into the many further details that would require sort of that cascade of policy decisions. If you want to have a renter credit, that's going to impact rates. If you're impacting rates, do you also need to adjust stabilization reserve, and by how much?
And that we didn't know clear understanding that because we were increasing the risk of volatility and we didn't want to subject schools to that we would need to have more money than is presently required by law set aside in a stability reserve.
Especially for the transition. So the transition, that was also, there was a lot of discussion about what's the appropriate time frame. One recommendation was to suspend penalties and interest on underpayments as taxpayers transition to this new tax structure. There was also the concern about changes with pupil weighting and how that might impact education spending and how that could impact the education fund. And then just really the amount of time that would be needed to fully transition from one system to the other. Also a few other policy areas that were highlighted that included escrow, because a lot of folks pay their property taxes when they have a mortgage through escrow. Additionally, the impact on tax increment financing districts, which this committee did not dive into. So those are just a few of the areas that were flagged as to be
Yeah, right
considered.
now, the threat of losing your home to tax sale does strongly encourage people to pay their property tax. This would be subject to fines and penalties like the income tax. Will that, that whole, what happens if you don't pay it? And how does that, it might lower your mortgage payments. But that whole area still remains to be explored in detail.
So is that, are you sort of a compare and contrast with, it's based on property? I don't know if we go to lien or tax sale, or as opposed to garnishing wages, or how you.
I mean, that's the whole, that's what,
Those are exactly, because if it's not a property-based tax, then that the lien wouldn't be done in the same way that it does with current property tax. But you do have other compliance tools like garnishing wages or bank levies. There are income tax type compliance tools.
If we are wrapping up, is there a number you can show us that, like, was there a big agreed upon like rate or a number that was discussed?
I can, if you like, I can put up on the screen the modeled results.
Yeah.
With the caveat that they were not agreed upon by the committee and they are not reflective of committee recommendations.
Oh, okay.
We do,
just the models as to what it might look like
Okay,
if.
they weren't agreed upon because they didn't feel confident in it or because they didn't like it, like what?
yeah, maybe they were not agreed upon is too strong. Do you want me to put them up? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, I think that the concern was that the same with the childcare study. If those rates went out, some people could get really upset. And those rates were theoretical, not based on any real budget,
Okay.
Income tax information is confidential, so we had to work with a generalized way through the tax department, which makes it just harder to do runs. But I think the committee was not comfortable having put out that this is what, was gonna happen to your income tax. Because there's an awful lot of levers in there, including any changes to the non-homestead tax classifications and rates. And it's for information only.
Yeah, so this is for information only. This is the second illustrative bracket that was examined. And this raises approximately 560 million. This 500, so this is on page 16 of the report. And this is from a number of caveats, which are spelled out earlier. And the bracket structure was just a first go at modeling.
I mean, we could do more brackets.
There could be more brackets, there could be less brackets, the change within the brackets, you know, as income moved from one bracket to the next, that change could be different. We were asked to model married and single brackets, but all of those decisions are policy decisions that a lot of them are still outstanding. And the total number of dollars needed to be raised by this education income tax is a rough estimate and reflective only of the recommendations that the committee made thus far.
I mean, the simplest thing, and I think what a lot of people were thinking, is that right now you're limited to a percentage of your income that you pay in property tax. So it's flat tax, everybody pays X percentage of their income. And the first thing we looked at was moving that bracket, the present system, up in income level. So you got more, which pushed more of the cost into the upper brackets. But I'm not even remembering, but that didn't, it didn't work.
Yeah,
It just didn't work. Didn't accomplish that kind of grade that we wished.
The 560 million, is that replacing, what are we replacing? Where's 560 come from?
yeah, so I'm just coming back here.
How much we taken from homesteaders now?
So it started out with raising 474 million, which is how much is net homestead. So when I say net homestead, that's the homestead property tax netting out the property tax credit, because we would no longer need to be raising the property tax credit. And then these are that first go at modeling the EIT, the education income tax rates to raise the 474. But raising 474 assumes that everyone is paying the education income tax and that there's no exemptions, there's no renter exemption, nothing like that. And so then the Department of Taxes came in and estimated that approximately 126 million would be raised on people who are not currently paying a homestead property tax. So that was a preliminary estimate from the Department of Taxes. So we said, okay, what would it look like to include raising that 126 further, so that in theory it could be all rebated back out. This was a very rough go, but that was the first step. So it's the 474 plus the 126. And then because the committee had decided to make that property that's beyond the 2 acres, the homestead property beyond the 2 acres, where the committee said, no, we're going to actually move that to the non-homestead category. We estimated, JFO estimated that would raise approximately 40 million when looking at prior grand list and non-homestead tax revenue. So when you put all of that together, it gives us that 560 roundabout. And then this was the first pass at modeling a tax structure, a progressive tax structure that would raise the 560. And then this is the effective education rates. That's what they would look like across AGI groups.
So that I'm assuming the committee did that 2 acre thing because as I'm trying to go back to my basic economics, I feel like this is going to incent people to have, if this were to go into effect, larger, more luxurious homes and to somehow shield or have lower incomes. And so you'd be motivated to have larger spreads, larger acreages spreading out into the countryside because you're not going to get taxed as much and you want to be house wealthy. Am I wrong?
I don't know.
Yeah.
And I mean, there were all those, if I think the rich are paying for it, not me or my property taxes, am I going to be more inclined to vote to spend more? You know, if I'm one of those poor communities who can't afford And, you know, even with the limitations, it's coming out of my grocery money. But if it's coming out of the rich guy's grocery money, am I gonna spend more? Those motivations we didn't get into. So we have got witnesses waiting in the hall. And I think I can say for every graph and every chart that appears in here, there are 3 or 4 more that didn't end up in the final report. Right down to, we didn't like the color of the circle because they were red. But this was really a theoretical, not, oh yeah, we're gonna do this, but a theoretical, what would it look like? And this is what it would look like. There are all kinds of levers we can push. I'm sure Julie would love to do more graphs and charts to tell us what we're doing, but that's what we came up with. Okay.
Thank you.
Can we go on to a wonderful world of health insurance and the cost of health insurance? Yeah, you want to take a 5-minute break? We've held them. Yeah, we've held them for 15 minutes. We got a 5-minute break while we change witnesses. Right, yeah, we used to just put up a sign that said committee in recess.
I'm supposed to stop it for breaks.
Okay, stop it for 5 minutes.